I'm Director of the Arts and Humanities and Health Medicine program in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. And it's great to see old faces and new faces. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Daniel Laforest, who is our first speaker as part of our all-speaker series this year. Thanks to Ms. Weber, who's done so much to organize all of this. I will just begin by introducing Daniel and sharing that sometimes you have to go away to find things back at home. So we connected up through a colleague of mine, Dr. Audrey Schaefer at Stanford University, who has the Medical Humanities program there. And she introduced me to Daniel Laforest, one of our faculty members at the University of Alberta, and we have since had many interesting conversations, and we'll learn more about his work that he started there as a visiting professor at the Center of Bioethics in the program of Medical Humanities. So Daniel Laforest is an associate professor of French and Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta here. His work focuses on North American and French literature as regards health, life narrative, organ timelines, and synthesis, and the interaction between daily life and the perceptions and expectations of individuals and the public regarding health, particularly as situated within North American urban and suburban life. His first book, La Chapelle de Caen, Pierre Parot et l'écriture. Du territoire. Was awarded the 2011 Jean Etier Award for Best Essay in Quebec Literature. His second book, L'âge du plastique, lire la ville contemporaine.
That's it.
Will come out in April 2016 along with an edited book collection on the biomedical body in Canadian culture. This past year, he was recipient of the Chair in Canadian Studies at the Université de
Limoges. In France, yes.
In France, as well as visiting professors at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, School of Medicine at Stanford University. Daniel has an interest not only in social implications of illness narratives, but also in physician writing, and I'm sure we will look forward to hearing about his work today, and also we'll want to stay in touch about all the many ways that your work continues to grow and evolve from this moment. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Pamela. I don't think I'll need that one because I'm mic'd up here. Thank you all for coming. This is great to have you in this impressive venue. For me to present this talk, this lecture, which is, for me, it's the beginning of a research. So you'll see what I'm about to present to you has it's got a feel of the early stage of a research that should grow and grow and grow exponentially, which is why this is the best time to probably attend that sort of lecture, because you'll get to engage with it more and more. There will be a Q&A session at the end, no worries. I don't go off the cuff that much, but I've decided to use lecture, a type of presentation I've grown fond of in the past few years, which is to use a PowerPoint and sort of interact with what goes on the screen. So you'll be able to follow, I hope, easily with what I have there. So this is just my presentation here. You've got two images that I guess you can figure out by yourself. We will start here. I'm going to show you. You might have noticed that I have a slight, teeny, tiny French accent. I don't think it's going to be a problem for any of you. It's charming at best, right? So the research at a glance. This is a new research. I've got my objectives. I'm just going to lay them on the table for you, so you'll know where we're going with that. But what I have to tell you today will hopefully, yeah, I'm kind of loud, right? It will already go beyond those objectives. So the proposed goals of that research, there's two of them. I'm only going to be focusing on the first one today. So the first goal is to examine how medical practices affect the traditional models of the narrative self. So I have lots to say about the narrative self today. It's not something that pertains only to the realm of literary studies. It is something, it's a concept, a notion that we have integrated in our own personal lives and that we deal with every day. One may call it the literary character, biographical self, or almost also the authentic self. The second objective, which I hope to develop later on, but I'm giving it to you right now as food for thought, is to assess the impact of the above, the first installment of my research, to assess its impact on the current conceptions of citizenry and responsibility. Those will be my two main concepts for later on, behind healthcare policies in Canada and in the US. So Pamela, in presenting me, has said that I've spent sometimes in the US, very recently, that was the past winter, as part of my first sabbatical. I was there, so I'm sort of like interacting with both worlds when it comes to medical and health humanities. And you all know that the Canada and the US have a lot of differences when it comes to health, the healthcare system. So this is fascinating in its own right. What I will touch upon in this presentation, I like images. There will be, I will start by saying a few words about what's going on right now, and this is something that I could witness firsthand when I was in the US, in Silicon Valley at Stanford, the rise of wearable health technologies and what it entails. So one could talk about it in a different way by saying that this is also the rise of big data when it comes to health, the information about our health or about illnesses and so on and so forth. So this is just my starting point. The second thing, of course, is the notion of life story, which is everywhere. The third thing, just a bunch of organs here. So I'm going to focus about something about the body, but in such a way, that was already part of my title actually, in such a way that I'm not going to talk about the whole. I'm going to try and figure out what we can do when it comes to narratives and organs and possibly organoids as well, and possibly something, things that are smaller than that. And finally, I will, well, like I said, smaller things will lead me to talk about eventual non-human components in our bodies. All right. So my first question, and this was the start of it all for me. I come from a literary background. I think you figured as much already, but I'm crossing over into full-on interdisciplinary at the moment. So sure enough, my first question had to do with where I come from. So I started with literature. I started with that bagage, that culture that I have for myself. Are literature and storytelling, which is the cardinal concept in literature, still useful in regards to medical practice? I know that for a lot of you in this room, this is a question that you have to deal with every day, and I bet you already have your own answers. Here's my train of thought when it comes to that initial question. So crowdsourcing and big data. Crowdsourcing is not storytelling, but it reveals a cultural and ethnical diversity when it comes to personal health management that can only be understood by paying attention to individual and family histories. This, perhaps you're missing, I mean, I know you're missing a part of my previous research because I was involved in a crowdsourcing experiment with the neighborhoods of Edmonton. And just to tell you really quickly, it didn't have anything to do with health to start with, but a lot of the results I got, the little narratives that I was looking for from people, from citizens of Edmonton, had to do with their own hygiene and health, and also their relationship with the proximity of health services and the hospital and so on and so forth. So their relation to their own communities and neighborhood had to do with health by an impressive margin, by an impressive majority. So that struck a chord with me right away. But I had to wonder about crowdsourcing, and sure enough, what's tied to it today, the rise of wearable health technologies. I know the Apple Watch may not be the success that they expected, but this is not relevant for when it comes to the technology itself. We're not going back. It's going to happen. We know it. Wearable health tech are among us right now. So and this is really important here for my study, they do bring the immediacy of data transfer from patient to specialist. This is efficiency. But such an immediacy leaves out the narrative time. Consequently, it makes the patient into even less of a character than before. When you can extract data and send it immediately online to the health practitioner, where's the patient? where's the story, right? It shortens the time that one would usually use to build a story. And yet, this is my other observation to start with, more and more physicians, and I'm talking about practicing doctors in the medical realm, are writing fiction. This is a fact. Are we talking about a trend when it comes to the publishing business? Why not? Sure, that's one factor, but I cannot explain it all. If only because physicians don't have much time to write as part of their own practice, and yet they are doing it. And they're writing fiction based on their experiences. Similarly, more and more authors are writing about their true experience with illness. Examples here, Terrence Holt. This is Perry Klass, who I've had the pleasure to meet when I was over in the US. And also Abraham Verghese. That was a smash hit. This Cutting for Stone was it's a great novel. He was also at Stanford. I got to meet him. Great writer. I think it's being made into a movie right now. It is a novel that is partly set within the medical world, but not only. So, from the onset, we can say that literary narratives might actually be more useful than ever now, at least when it comes to the medical world. That's one thing we can suppose. But if medical practices and medical care are experiencing radical shifts today thanks to social networks and biotechnologies, which is what I've said before, what happens to literature? What happens? How come we have to deal on the one hand with more and more physicians publishing and a public who's more and more interested in getting insight into that world, whereas be it through fiction or nonfiction, and at the same time, why is it that we have to deal with this ambiguous or paradoxical fact that the more immediate data transfer technology we have, the less options we have to weave a story out of that whole biosystem, call it however you want. So I've been emphasizing the life story, and in my discussions with people in the field or not, in my own field, this is where I've run into the most obstacles, because people are, everybody will admit that the life story is important, but most people, especially in literary studies, will tell you that it's a model that you should not emphasize that much. So people don't really believe in it, and yet everybody's relating to it. So from this is just what I said, from the standpoint of my discipline, the life story is everywhere, and yet it is being perceived today as being rather conservative. What with all the literary theories that we've had in the past years, what with the fact that the avant-garde of the modern era have done away with any ideas of the bourgeois individual and those things. Apparently, that's what literature is all about. Modern literature, that is. A couple of examples. But here's the thing, and I'm almost paraphrasing Atul Gawande here. The life story, as something that we all possess and relate to, it comes to the forefront almost immediately whenever our health is being put on the spot by circumstances. Whenever our health is being put on the spot in such a way that the self becomes threatened. This is when the life story comes back. People facing the possibility of their own death, of course, will reflect on their life. Even the fact, and this is kind of a mundane reference to give you now because we all know about it and nobody's experienced it, I hope. The fact that when you experience a near-death moment, your whole life is supposed to flash in front of your eyes. This is a common ground, but common grounds, they hold truth, right? So that's an important hinge in my reasoning. In other words, that would be the way that I would phrase it personally, for health to become a conscious thought, because most of the time we don't think about our health, it requires the broader container, the broader frame, the broader image of our life, in scare quotes. This also has this collective aspect to it, because when you think about social or public health, well, it's the life of society. What is the life of society? It's this collective, this consensus that we all have, that society should progress for the better good. It means that it's part of a story, roughly, okay? But we refer to these things all the time. So you've got the life story right here. Illness, of course, well, it's from birth to death, right? The same person. And I don't think that anybody in this room will deny the fact that when we witness a birth, we consciously or unconsciously think of the beginning of a story. And sure enough, when we see somebody getting close to death, we, again, consciously or unconsciously think of the end of a story. Illness, it becomes an obstacle in this frame, in one's path. Chronic illness can imply the need to adapt over time, which is not contradictory with the life story. And sure enough, near death will often be seen as rebirth for many people. Here's Atul Gawande, who I suspect most of you know. This is a fantastic quote from his latest book. Unlike your experience, so he differentiates two selves. Unlike your experiencing self, the one that we deal with every day, which is absorbed in the moment, your remembering self is attempting to recognize not only the peaks of joys and valleys of misery, but also how the story works as a whole. I told you I was paraphrasing Gawande. I didn't make anything up here. He sums it up better than I would do. So that's the importance of the life story in my perspective here. Now, let's talk about some new perspectives that will throw a wrench into this whole thing, that would challenge this model. Can I point here and it will work? Oh yeah. All right. Quotation, a little bit long, I apologize in advance, from Terrence Holt, his latest collection of short stories which are all interconnected, so it's almost a novel. It's called Internal Medicine. He's a physician. He's also a writer. He runs a program in Health Humanities, I think at Johns Hopkins or Yale, I don't know, but in the East Coast. He's great. He's a great writer, especially. Here's the quotation from him. I'm standing in the middle of this roar and babble. It's the ER. My pager is going off more or less continuously. The phones are ringing, the unit clerk is crying out names, one of which, if I could only hear him, might be mine, to come and take call. I'm worried about one patient who might be hemorrhaging, another who could be going septic, and still another who simply isn't getting better for reasons no one understands. It's unlikely I've eaten since 5 that morning. My feet probably hurt. I know I'm tired. Details blur. Still, I remember very clearly one day when I looked out over this scene and said to myself, this is not narratable. We have a writer here who says that a scene out of his own experience, his own medical experience, is not narratable. We have to go a little bit further. That's what we do in literary studies. What exactly is not narratable? Because we just read something. The physician slash writer slash narrator plays the role of a perfectly traditional character. There's no problem there. The experience itself, as far as I'm concerned, is also narratable, because he goes on to make his whole book about it, Internal Medicine. It is the body at large, caught in this chaotic affair, that encounters problems of narratability, if you will. It is the body that comes into question in there. The medicalized body. The body that's thrown into this Jackson Pollock sort of chaotic scene or environment. The body cannot be narrated in the same way that the self has been or is being traditionally narrated. We have a schism here. We have a schism, a separation, right? Thus, my central hypothesis. I'm really following a methodic course of actions with you here. This is central, of course, to my research. We are experiencing a paradigm shift within the relation of literature to medicine. It used to be that storytelling would encompass, traditionally, would encompass and dominate the entire network of what would be a life, if you will. Persona, health, illness, pain, treatments, hope, despair, death. You can add whatever you want to that chain. Storytelling was perfectly able to do so. In literature, well, from the German standpoint, there's the tradition of the Bildungsroman. I know in French, but I've never known in English what the Bildungsroman is. Perhaps a German person in the room could help? The what?
The coming of age.
Coming of age story, exactly, thank you. The coming of age story. So you get born, you become somebody, and then there's this whole thread of the self that grows and grows in the Bildungsroman. Of course, it's a frame. In philosophy, it's called the narrative self. The main proponent of this conception is called Paul Ricoeur. He wrote extensively about the importance of narrative time in the definition of the self. So in this context that I call traditional, but that we all relate to, the writer was expected to produce his work despite his bodily or mental impairments. There is this expectation. Homer himself is supposed to have been blind, but you also will relate to a fantastic classical writer like Virginia Woolf, knowing that she was this genius despite her impairments. Well, she was struggling with unipolar depression, mental illness in her case, and we all know where that led, but, right, we have the work. There's Philip Roth, who wrote about the body as part of his fictions, but he's been very vocal, still alive, Philip Roth. He's been very vocal in the last years that he was still writing about his chronic back pain and the fact that as a writer, it was the most horrible thing one could experience, and he was really grumpy about it, but he made it almost into his persona as a writer. Stephen Hawking, do I need to insist? So I'm bridging the gap here between fiction and nonfiction. It doesn't really matter because I'm interested in the larger framework in which we could think of the writer as somebody who would overcome his bodily restrictions. So Stephen Hawking is a brain inside a challenged body. This is how we think of him. The character in the text was expected to stay whole as a character despite severe illness experienced in the medical context. So here you have Thomas Mann's a grand work, The Magic Mountain, which is it all takes place in a sanatorium. More recently, in nonfiction, you have Andrew Solomon, who wrote, again, about depression from his own standpoint. This is purely his own experience that makes him into a researcher on depression. And if you read that wonderful book, he is the I leading the whole thing, right? Despite, in the first chapter, his admitting that depression not only almost killed him, but made him into somebody who could not literally function, let alone talk. Right, so all of these examples, they fall under what I've said before. But today, I would claim that the medical experience and the medical knowledge of the body are now preceding and shaping the literary ones. The medical experience and the medical knowledge of the body, it has shifted, it is flipped, right? Are now preceding and shaping the literary ones. That's the hypothesis. So I'm going to slowly wrap this presentation because I really want to have an equal time for questions and for lecturing. I'm not done yet. I've got 3 problems and 3 thought experiments for literature to try and confront itself with today that I'm offering you as food for thought again. The first problem involving a thought experiment, 1977. Again, some of you may know about this classic text. Susan Sontag, way before she herself would have to face cancer, the cancer that immediately killed her. She wrote about cancer, and she remarked that immunologists are classifying the body's cancer cells as non-self. We're in 1977, this is part of Illness as Metaphor, a great nonfiction piece. by Susan Sontag. So this is my first remark. What does that mean? What does that entail for us? Thought experiment. Oh, in connection with that, sorry. I'm connecting two references here. One, much newer. In 2014, Canadian philosopher Joseph Heath reminded us of Joshua Lederberg's theory of microbiota ecology. Here's the quotation. In our body, non-human cells outnumber human cells by at least 10 to 1. That's a fact. That's a fact. That's Lederberg's theory of microbiota. These ecosystems of non-human and yet living things that are part of our body that take part in its functioning and that will eventually adapt to the different circumstances that our body will offer them, if you will, right? So it's a commensal thing in ecology. There we go. So let's try to shift this to literature. What are we going to do with this in literature? That's why I'm talking about a thought experiment. Literary writing can certainly represent the idea of the entanglement of the human and the non-human. That's not a problem. But it cannot integrate it to the model of a life story without running into some contradictions that eventually can be done away with, but that are quite stimulating when you run into them. In this case, as far as I'm concerned, I'm suggesting that the contradictions would have to do with the scale of a story, if you're going from the ensemble of the self that is represented by, that is embodied in one body, and the myriad of non-human yet living cells or microbes that are living inside a body. You have a problem of scale when it comes to your story. Those are the nuts and bolts of literary analysis. You also have a problem of what I call the multi-agency inside of a body. I am an agent with my body, but there are millions of agents inside my body that do not perform the same actions, obviously. It's not even clear if what they're performing are actions. But one can tell that I'm not alone in my body. And of course, with the thresholds in between those categories. Not providing answers here, I'm offering questions. That's kind of a Republican way of putting things forward. But this is what I think intellectuals should be doing. Before you try to offer questions, you try to find, offer answers. You try to find the right questions. And this is the start of at least 3 literary inquiries into the body using the theory of microbiota ecology. All right, my second problem, my second thought experiment would be Courtney Moreno. In her first novel, great novel, I recommend it to you, it's been published by McSweeney's in San Francisco. Her first novel, she's from LA, Courtney Moreno writes that there are very few involuntary body functions that you have control over. And then she waxed lyrical about this. Musical instruments live inside you, wind, percussion, and string. She finds it really beautiful. But here, we want to focus on the fact, on something that we know, of course, but we don't think about it that much often. We don't have control over most of our bodily functions. So we often hear that one. Organs think by themselves. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they think, but they certainly do act and live according to their own timeline. This implies that several meaningful moments in a life story, like falling in love or experiencing severe pain, think of other examples, are the consequence of or the partial consequences of independent movements and heterogeneous rhythms inside the body. This is a dangerous suggestion because it could veer into a purely materialistic proposition that everything that we think we are is purely electrical neuronal exchanges in the brain, and that our cells are slowly dying. That sums us up. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we have to take into account the fact that much of what we consider to be the main moments in our lives have multiple agencies to them. And some of those agencies, again, like with the microbiota theory, some of those agents or agencies are not voluntary. Even in falling in love and that kind of thing, right? Okay. The third problem, the last one, last thought experiment. In 2010, American philosopher Levi Bryant wrote that the organism can no longer be treated as a passive object, such that genes and the environment are the subjects forming this object. But rather, the organism itself becomes a subject that plays a role in how its genes are actualized and how its environment is constructed. So I'm not going to go at the micro molecular level with the genes, but I'm going to consider the environment, so the macro level in this suggestion here. This, what Bryant wrote, is actually an interpretation of the extended mind thesis, which is all the rage in cognitive sciences today. You can look at Andy Clark, he's the main advocate for it. What's the deal with this thesis? Well, it suggests that we embody, literally we embody, parts of our environment to function. The mind-body system thinks by actively integrating elements from its concrete environment and by relegating some of its memories to the same environment. So we're not putting material objects inside our body. Again, this is not what I'm saying, obviously, but we are never alone. We are in constant relation with a given organization of things around us, and our memory, in order to function, ourself, in order to think of itself, will need that extension to a given environment. There you go. The questions that for me arise from this third thought experiment. When we become ill, what else becomes ill with us? That would be a political question. It has political implications. If I become ill, can I think of my family unit as sharing my illness? Intuitively, we want to go yes, but what does that entail? Right? When I become ill, am I ill as part of an ill healthcare system? So on and so forth. Oh, there you go again, Virginia Woolf. I love Virginia Woolf. A Room of One's Own, written years ago, decades, a century ago, was already tackling, unknowingly probably, the same intuition. That, well, if you've read it, it's been a while for me, but there's this room and there's the feeling of pain as something that sort of meshes with the closed environment in her case. Second question for me, what happens to the story of persons who have had to move through several different medical and healthcare environments in their lifetime? A question for our time. So it is cultural, of course, but post-colonial in terms of having to do with the much increased mobility of citizens and people across the planet. So here we're also talking about environments, because when you go through a medical system and then you have to experience an altogether different medical system, what happens to the story of your illness? What happens to the ways in which you relate to pain, in which you will make it into a story? I mean, the questions are endless here. Abraham Verghese's book integrates that context, actually, Cutting for Stone, among other things. And lastly, what kind of memory does the medical record of somebody who's been through that, what kind of memory does their medical record hold? How much truth does the so-called medical history of a patient leave out about his or her or his life? So here I'm really talking about the medical practice. You know how to diagnose an illness, the first thing that will be asked for is the medical history of the patient. But sure enough, it can't be the same history as the life story. And the medical history will be completely removed from the environments in which every single aspect or elements in the medical history will have been integrated when they were happening. So are we still talking about truth? Am I playing on words? Perhaps in the way I suggested, but concretely, those things still exist, and they're still paradoxical. So no, I'm not playing on words. So yeah, I would call it an epistemological question because it comes from my reasoning of having to do with the life story, the narrative, and theory and philosophy, but it throws us back into the medical realm with concrete questions about, like I said, the medical history, and also this ever-changing notion of the medical record, which is now completely digitalized, right? It's become data. So that would be the third question linked to this third thought experiment. All right, conclusion now. So what we've seen is that with the traditional life story in literature, we have been narrating the body as a system. Traditionally, that's what we've always been doing. We have not been narrating the components of the body. But we've seen that illness and health are increasingly becoming affairs of parts and components, of micro-visualization enabled by the growing technologies of visualization in medical practice, and data encoding and accessibility. All those questions don't have to do with the body as a whole, right? We need, and this I'm adamant about, we need new life story models and new metaphors. The title of this talk was The Weird Things That Literature Does with the Body. So far I've mostly been talking about the weird things that medicine does to literature, but this is where you can flip it again, because those new models, those new metaphors will rise from imagination, in conjunction, of course, with our daily experiences. So far, just to give you an idea, just to wrap this up, science fiction was the only domain in which we could imagine the extension of a narrative beyond the life of one's body. Think of the robots, think of all those things, but that's not what I've been talking about today, because this isn't true anymore. The medical domain today creates more challenges to literature than the imagination of science fiction writers ever did. I'll leave you with that kind of punchy proposition. All right, thank you.
I'm just going to come around with a megaphone for your questions so that we can hear you on the recording.
I really appreciate many of the questions you raised in your talk. But a question that comes from me is, what do you mean by the self, by the narrative self, by the authentic self? You reference Ricoeur, and for Ricoeur, the self isn't immediately accessible. It's not wholly transparent. Phenomenologically, we would never make that claim either. So what is the self that you are referencing? The self that thinks, the self that acts, the self that lives.
Well, thank you. You're right on every count. To answer really shortly, I think that the self, we don't know where it is, and yet we all believe in it. So the self is this background that we believe in, and over which our actions, we believe our actions to be taking place. And to get closer to my own topic, the self is what we believe to come into jeopardy whenever our body is affected, whenever our integrity, what we believe to be our integrity, is affected. So if I fall ill of a diagnosed illness, my body is ill. Myself is not necessarily ill, but I will relate to this illness via myself, via this belief that I have in this integrity being ill.
So with that comment, I would encourage you to read Jean-Luc Nancy and The Intruder, because then he really shows us an illness, what is the self, and whether all these organs, these parts, these pieces of us, what actually is strange and what really is ours, and what constitutes me. Because I think that really would complement nicely with what they're trying to tell.
And again, thank you, because I never thought of, I touched upon philosophy a little bit at first, but I never thought of giving the example of Jean-Luc Nancy, but he is part of those non-fiction writers, and yet those philosophers who personally have had to deal with an assault on their body. He had a heart transplant. He's a philosopher. To my knowledge, he's the only one who had to deal with that. And he's a phenomenologist, so it goes to show. Perfect example. Thank you. Thank you. I will think about that.
Hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I thought that was a great talk, and one thing that I became really interested in is when you were talking about brains within bodies that are, not functioning. Stephen Hawking and all these different people. What I started thinking about was, what about in people with mental disorders where the organ itself is constricted, and how do narratives start to function within that sort of domain? Like, do you become interested in sort of these non-literature components, such as like psychiatric narratives, and speaking, these other discursive artifacts that someone like Michel Foucault would be really, really interested in, because they give this really fascinating glimpse at a whole section of our social existence. So, I'm just wondering, you're talking a lot about literature and books and publications, but also I'm wondering what your thoughts are on these sort of subjective knowledges, subjugated knowledges.
So, in short, your question is about what would I do with the whole continent of mental impairment and mental illness within the framework of my research. I'm reconducting what Michel Foucault himself was criticizing. And I apologize to science if that's the fact, but I'm leaving it out. I'm leaving mental illness out at the moment because I think that it calls for a different methodology to approach it. And as I go along, I'm moving more and more away from the classic mind-body dualism that goes philosophically, that goes back to Descartes. I don't think that there's an interrelation or a separation that is so easy to deal with, which would enable me to include mental illness as part of bodily illnesses and to think about the whole as a system. I'm moving away from that. So that would be my answer to you, is I'm simply methodologically speaking, leaving it out. Because the tools that within my own training I would have to deal with those are tools that come from critical studies, philosophy, and that whole French thing. So well, that's where I come from. And so Michel Foucault, with the history of madness, right, said that in order to be able to speak of the mad person, we had to push the mad person away so our speech could take over. His aim was to stop the social speech and bring the mad person to the forefront, which is really subversive. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari did the same thing with schizophrenia. So I know that there's a lot to deal with there, which is why I'm going elsewhere with my methodology, because I would have to fight against or accept those things, and I'm not ready for that at the moment. It's too big.
Thank you. I'm curious if the concept of archetypes in the Jungian context, the narrative that's implied by that way of looking at things, has informed in any way what your thinking is.
It doesn't. The universality of archetypes, when you put it as your starting point, I think you shut the door on the possible political questions that may arise from differences that are not being chosen by people. So basically you shut down the political. But you're putting me on the spot here because your question is perfectly legitimate. It is broad, and I don't know much about the Jungian theory. I think my knee-jerk reaction here is that the universal is a notion that leaves a way to political, so I would be more of a Freudian when it comes to dealing with, but then again, that would involve the mental illnesses. So I left those things out for the moment, and if I was to include them, then I would work along the path of the Freudian psychoanalysis, and I would leave the Jungian one out. That is my personal take on it. And you can tell how uneasy your question makes me, because precisely it probably is a very good question. That's why I'm uneasy about it. But yeah, that's the best answer I can give you at the moment, is I'm not comfortable with archetypes and universal concepts.
Perhaps a little bit close.
An idea that is not mine. It comes from somebody else on this campus, smarter than me, Leanne McTavish. And Leanne talks about the humoral system and our ideas about the body during the humoral system, and how we thought the body was, all flow and fluids, and blockages were an issue, and choosing the right wet nurse could, impact the psychology of your child. That thinking, and then we moved into what we are kind of doing today, the mechanical idea that we're like machines with engines and filters and tubes and hoses, and our doctors are mechanics, and in fact we talk about the body that way. Your heart is your engine. And she predicts that we're moving towards thinking about the body as an ecology, as an ecosystem. And I'm wondering if we do think about the body as an ecosystem and all of those component non-human parts as being critical to who we are and who the self is, does that then also change our ideas about our longevity in terms of our soul, our capacity to transfer memory, our capacity to live beyond the body?
Definitely it does. I'm not there yet, but just to give you an example, what your intervention made me think of two things. The first one is a conversation I've had with somebody at Stanford, a faculty there who runs, they have a think tank to try and influence public policy on the genome project at Stanford, so he was into gene and that sort of thing. And I thought that where it was at today was immortality studies, especially since I was in California, so I thought I would get a little taste of this whole let's live forever kind of thing, and science will help us. He said, no, this is so 2001. What we're into right now is longevity studies. So this is it. This is where it's at right now. To think of the body as something that can be not only extended in terms of lifetime, but to think of the experience of the body as something that can be extended in terms of enjoyment, of pleasure. So it's the disappearance of pain, basically. Now, the models that you're talking about, you said the humerus?
The humoral, so in medieval times.
Right, les humeurs in French, the humoral, yeah, black bile and that sort, yeah, exactly. So if it comes back as a metaphor today for what flows into the body and what can eventually encompass the body itself into some other shapes, also, I think that leads us to think that the ecology of the body means that the body is nothing but interrelations, is nothing but the ensemble, the ensemble of all its potential interrelations. This, in philosophy, is something that I have a hard time dealing with, because if we are nothing but relations, then it means that all those relations are potentially already there, right? And there's no possibility for creating something new. So I stopped there. And I've been talking about the thresholds. I've been talking about the importance of the thresholds when it comes to the organs, when it comes to the humoral system, when it comes to those microbes inside us that are helping us to function. We could easily end up thinking of this as a system that is I'm lacking one word here, but this whole integrated system. And I want to maintain the thresholds. I want to maintain the spaces of uncertainty, the spaces of mystery inside the body, because I truly believe that if we're to think of different models of longevity, eventually of the absence of pain, immortality, or just cures, then we have to leave spaces to philosophically, in terms of thought experiments, be able to absolutely create new models, which is not possible, I think, with the virtual relations that are always already there.
So, Daniel, I'm wondering about, I'm going to take up this final point here about science fiction, because you didn't really talk much about it, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot. But one of the things that science fiction does is warn us about possible abuses in the future, right? And so we think about science fiction that addresses medical issues, like some of the genetic engineering and these sort of things. They warn us. This are the potential abuses we're going to have. They warn us about a dystopian future we might be heading towards, right, if we don't change. What about these contemporary? I'm not familiar with a lot of the contemporary medical literature, like literature in the sense of like literary. Is it warning us about something, or is it reflecting? Is it reflecting just the reality, the changes in the realities of the different ways we're seeing the body now, as you talked about, or is there this possibility that it's giving us a warning sign about some dystopian future we're approaching?
If that's a genre, bio science fiction, I don't think I just coined it. Perhaps I don't know if it exists, but. As far as I know, and I'm not an avid reader, because there's only so many books you can read in a lifetime of science fiction today, but I don't think that there's any warning going on in terms of, if we look at because I'm thinking of the Andromeda strain and those narratives that, from a few decades ago, that to me had to do with science fiction, possible future, but even more so had to do with the problem of management, of governmentality. And so they were warning us about the fact that if the government does not manage the possibilities, then we could end up with a future that's non-desirable for humanity. But the technology itself, except perhaps for the virus and Andromeda strain, I'm not sure that the best science fiction had to do with a technology being inherently bad. I think it always had to do with the political context in which it was thrown. So today, I think that, again, what I personally deem to be the best science fiction would not be political in that sense. I've got only one example for you, and I don't think that it's in one book per se, but I've read about it lately, and it blew my mind. And I gave that at MLCS also, the talk that we had in our department. The example of nanobots and nanotechnology. People talk a lot about nanotechnology as something that can help increase and like break barriers into the medical realms and the way that we relate to the body. And so there's this idea that in the near future, our internal organism can eventually be regulated or helped or function thanks to the physical integration of nanobots, little robots that would sort of take over some of our functions as we grow older and help us, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's in the air. That is concretely something that people are researching. Now that struck me as a reversal of the classic science fiction trope of the robot. Because here's the thing, is with the robot, and it's always the same problem with the robot, which I think that's why they're so passé, because the robot is a machine that we've built, and then we run into the wall of having to figure out its capacity to be like a human, to have emotions, and that's always a problem with robots, and we've never achieved it. Now, nanobots, they are robots that you integrate inside a human, and that potentially, and here's the threshold, right? Potentially, if nanobots were to become developed enough, then the body itself would die but the nanobots would have taken over the functions in such a way that the body would still be going thanks to the nanobots. So we've reversed completely this idea of a robot trying to have emotions. It's a robot, it's a myriad of tiny robots taking over the envelope that we consider to be emotionally sound to start with. Yeah, I don't know what time it is.
We're coming to the end of our time. If we had more time, I might invite you to talk a little bit perhaps about, or ask you about Rita Sharon and getting back in the bedside with and the medical chart, where she's often written about physicians. It's helpful to write a parallel chart about how you experience your care for the patient, things that wouldn't go into the medical chart. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But it brings it back to physician writing and the function of that. And I wonder about a challenge or a new framing where it's not just individual life stories, but collective stories and narratives as they're forming together. And, so that might be an opportunity for another conversation. But at this point, thank you for all your very, very good questions and comments, and I'm sure you're going to stay a little bit longer, that Daniel would be available to connect and talk a little bit more. But thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.